morning. So here's something wonderful. You know, I've been talking about the Force for Good by the Dalai Lama and Daniel Goleman. So just this morning, guess what I opened? The Science of Mind magazine, and there he is, my guy. And he's talking about courage to live compassionately, which is what we're talking about today, the courage to live compassionately. So before I start, I want to tell you a little story about compassion. There was this very wealthy Christian church that was predominantly mature, older people. And they had decided that they would start a campaign to attract younger people. Now, it so happened that their church was right across the street from a college. And there was a young fellow, Bill, who had just found his spiritual life. So Bill, they called him the Wild One. He decided he would go across the street to this very wealthy, mature church. And he arrived with his hair all askew and a t-shirt on and barefooted. And the church was filled to capacity, and Bill couldn't find a seat. So what he did is he walked down the center row as all of these very mature, wealthy people watched him parade down the center aisle, and he sat right in front of the platform because there was no place else for him to sit. Well, it happened that there was a deacon who was very sophisticated, wearing a three-piece suit. He was quite mature, in his 80s, and he started down the aisle right behind Bill. And the minister was paralyzed, and all of the congregation was watching this very mature man with his cane walking down the aisle. And the congregation's thoughts were, and I'm speculating now, what in the world is that deacon going to say to that young man sitting barefooted right in front of the platform? And there was this big collective inhalation. So what happened was the deacon put his cane down and struggled to sit down next to the young man. And the minister said this: what I'm about to talk about, you'll never remember. What you just saw, you will never forget. He said, be careful how you live your life. You may be the only Bible some people have ever read. So that's what we're talking about, living a life of compassion as if you are the Word of Spirit. So now the Dalai Lama has done a lot of research about compassion, because he is not only a man of religion, he is also a man of science. And so whenever he teaches or speaks, he prefers to have scientific information to back him up. So he reported that we are naturally predisposed to moral sensibilities and to compassion. And he cited the research of Kylie Harmon, who is a developmental psychologist at the University of British Columbia, who did a study with infants, 3 months, 6 months, and 9 months. And she showed these infants a cartoon with just shapes, a circle, a triangle, and a square. And the circle, they were sort of animated and humanized. They had eyes, and the circle was struggling, in this cartoon, was struggling up the top of the mountain. And the triangle came along and helped the circle. Now these are infants that are watching this cartoon. And the triangle comes along and helps the circle reach the top of the mountain. And then the circle is struggling up the mountain, and the square comes along and beats it down and causes it to roll down to the bottom of the mountain. And then the children are offered shapes to play with. They show a decided preference for the triangle because they recognize the whole concept of helping. So that was the study that the Dalai Lama quoted. And he told the Wall Street Journal that even 3 months old show a preference to helping, not hindering. And then he also talked about Richard Davidson's, who founded the Center for Investigative Health, Healthy Minds, who teaches preschoolers to recite this line. And I think we can all take a lesson from this. And the line is, may all I think, say, and do not hurt anyone and help everyone. So preschoolers are now learning to cite that phrase. So I also, this is just an aside about the Dalai Lama. He doesn't shop very often, but he had some time, and so he went shopping, and he bought a toy for his cat. And he said this, someone bought me a tiny wobbly stray kitten. If they'd left it on the street, it would have died, so I took care of it. Now, it loves most the person who feeds it. That is me. So the Dalai Lama, I have to think how lonely his life actually must be. His family is sort of isolated from him. His mother is dead. And he says how his mother was the one that taught him compassion and taught him how to love, as he suggests that most mothers do. But he talks about folks that benefit most from compassion are the people who feel compassion. And he talks about the helper's high, that circuits of pleasure are activated when we mentally focus on helping someone else. Along with this inner reward, the circulatory, circulatory, that buzzes when we focus on ourselves, stop. So when we have the helper's high, our inner circulatory, you know that word. Circuitry. That's it. This is getting the audience involved. See, don't you feel better by helping me? And she's just like buzzed by helping. That's right. So we benefit the most from helping people because that's our natural propensity, and we are wired that way from childhood, that we know that it feels good to help people. And so the reciprocity of giving and receiving, of caring and receiving care, is so beneficial to humanity. Piero Ferrucci, who wrote The Power of Kindness, and oh, what a lovely book that is, he quotes the Buddha of the 11 qualities and gifts of giving. And I'm going to share those with you. This is according to Ferrucci, who is quoting the Buddha. If you are being compassionate, you will sleep easily. You will wake early. Now, see, I can benefit from that right off the bat. You'll have pleasant dreams. People will love you. Celestial beings and animals will love you. Celestial beings will protect you. External dangers will not harm you. Your face will be radiant. Your mind will be serene. You will die unconfused. And you'll be reborn in happy realms. So that's what the Buddha said about compassion and living a life of kindness. There are certainly benefits that have been recognized forever from living a life of kindness. So another person named Dr. Keltner conducted studies about social interactions and how we interact in compassionate ways and perhaps less compassionate ways. And what this study indicated was that people of higher power or perceived power were less attuned than people of lower power. And okay, the people of higher power, perceived higher power, more influential, were less attuned than the people of lower power or lower influence.
Okay, thank you.
And so the study indicated that people of higher power were less attentive in conversations, and they met others' gazes less often, and they often interrupted more and monopolized the conversation. I think that's very interesting, and what I want to mention is that the Dalai Lama, when he went to Russia, he was a guest, and he entered this room full of people who were leaders and powerful leaders within the Russian government and the Russian culture. And he went directly to a guard at the door and thanked the guard for being there. The Dalai Lama has a habit and a tendency to notice the disenfranchised in any circumstance and situation and attend to that person. That's living his compassion. So when we talk about higher powered, more influential, whatever language that you want to use, you know who I'm talking about. You know the ones that are so full of themselves. How they ignore others. And so I want to share this reading with you. A friend of mine, Sandy Schornhorst, she's one of the practitioner students that I taught in Albuquerque. She shared this writing on Facebook, and it speaks to what I think is the topic of compassion. Let me get my tissue here. So she says, members of the natal tribes of South Africa greet each other with the phrase, Sawubona, which literally translates to mean, I see you. Last week, she says, I sat in a Starbucks near Embarcadero in San Francisco drinking my $5 cup of coffee and looking out at the people passing by. Just outside the door, there was a woman sitting on a plastic crate with a little dog sleeping in a similar crate beside her. In one hand, she held up the little newspapers the homeless sell on down the street in San Francisco. In the other, an empty used styrofoam cup. So for 15 minutes, I sat there and watched as she was actively ignored by passersby. They looked up and down and at their cell phones so they would not have to meet her eye. She didn't speak, she didn't beg, she just sat quietly holding her paper and her paper cup as the world passed by, ignoring her. As I left, I went over to her and had a 20-second exchange. I put $1 in her cup, placed my hand on hers, and said, "I want you to know you are not invisible, no matter how much those people are pretending that you are." She was taken aback and smiled and offered a faint thank you, and that was that. I didn't ask for her story, although I am sure she had one. We all do. I didn't give a second thought to what she was going to do with the $1 once it left my hand. It was no longer mine. I don't know what that encounter meant to her, if anything, but I know what it meant to me, and that is enough. Sawabona. So the Dalai Lama speaks of what he calls muscular compassion. It's not idle sweetness and light. That is not his concept of compassion. His concept of compassion is to hold people accountable for misdeeds while he loves them. And he commended Nelson Mandela for the way that he handled the whole after of the apartheid by holding people accountable for their atrocities and still forgiving them and loving them. And the Dalai Lama considers Gandhi one of his great heroes because of the way that he stood up for the Indian people with nonviolence, with muscular compassion. And then the Dalai Lama, and I love this, wrote a letter to St. Francis, Pope Francis, a letter to Pope Francis, commending him when he demoted the German, what they called the Bishop of Bling. Remember that? So the Bishop of Bling, Franz Peter Tebets van Elst, had spent upward of $43 million on his private residence, replete with bronze window frames, $30,000 bathtub, and $1 million landscaping job. And the Pope stripped him of his powers and admonished him in a very loving way. And the Dalai Lama really appreciated that and used that as an example of muscular compassion, standing up for the disenfranchised, caring for those that society tends to abuse, while holding in love and compassion the abusers. So he talks about even opposing while we oppose the action, we need to have compassion toward the actors. And that's the whole concept of forgiveness. It's not forgiving the act, but forgiving the actor. And that's the place of compassion. So when we talk about muscular compassion, when we talk about the Dalai Lama's idea of compassion. It is to be willing to see the unseen, to be willing to acknowledge those that are suffering, try to alleviate their suffering, but acknowledging them and recognizing them. As my friend Sandy says, sawubona. So, my dear ones, sawubona to you. Namaste. So I'd invite the practitioners to stand and join us and hold the community in consciousness as we say our final prayer. When I was very young, I was so impressed with